if you just stood naked in front of the mirror right now and just looked at yourself, and then the thought is how I eat and how I exercise and how I live makes you look like that.
Bringing you a reasoned approach to health and fitness. This is the Phi Life Podcast.
Welcome to the Phi Life Podcast. I'm John Barbin. With me is Brad Pilon, and today we're brought to you by the Total T Clinic, and we're going to be talking about adaptability, and we're going to try to think our way through this concept of the modern Western, I guess, obesity epidemic and or overweight, and that, you know, what was the stats just recently? About 40% of Americans are technically obese as per the BMI.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out if they'd maybe altered the way we do BMI or the cutoffs, and we may have a little bit, but it's still startlingly high, right? So yeah, they're big numbers, which means that the interventions we've tried to date haven't stuck. It doesn't mean they were wrong. It just means that whatever we suggested, either they didn't work or people weren't able to do them as directed.
Yeah, and then every diet you can think of has been tried, and over the last 2 or 3 decades, diets people would have never even considered. 30 years ago, people didn't know the idea of keto, like the idea of eating like really high fat. And I mean, people kind of understood low carb, but not the idea of like specifically a lot of fat. And then carnivore, this is very new. Like people would have never considered just eating mostly meat. Like
couldn't afford it. Jeez.
Well, I still can't afford it, but
sure.
Basically every way you can slice up your diet, people have tried, and none of them are in the lead versus any other, obviously competing to try to reduce the general rise in obesity in all developed countries, because it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, that's 40% of people are technically above the obesity line in United States, but
so not overweight, but
no. And then another
obese.
30 are overweight. So that's 70 total in the overweight plus obesity, and 9% of that are in the extreme, like really obese.
Yeah, and before you start thinking, but BMI sucks because it doesn't measure muscle, unless you think that the vast majority 40% of North America is just really well muscled, when you use BMI on a population the way it was intended, these are good numbers, right? These are generally pointing towards an excess of adipose tissue on the body, and not just a whole bunch of powerlifters walking around or bodybuilders, right? So it's not just a bunch of jacked girls and guys.
Yeah, give me a break. You're telling me 40% of the American population is just heavily muscled? No.
Yeah, no.
Now that might... So the caveat there, as Brad stated, it might not apply to you specifically if you have a lot of muscle, but the concept that all industrialized nations, as they become wealthy, the obesity and overweight rises. It's not because everyone's just lifting a lot of weights.
Yeah,
just as an example of how few people actually lift weights with any actual vigor. Back when I was in college, I had various jobs as a personal trainer in various gyms, and a couple of my managers asked me one day, like, how many people of the members of this gym, of a gym, which is already a small portion of the city, how many people here do you think that have a membership use the weight room? And I was like, I don't know, like half. He's like 1%. 1% of our membership uses the weight room. He's like, a huge portion of them just sort of come in and out once in a while, go to a class, or like, it's one of those bigger gyms that have classes and things like that.
Right.
So he's like, a huge portion of our membership only has a membership to go to a spin class, a yoga class, some of these organized classes. He's like, another huge chunk of them just come in to do cardio regularly, and some of them might pass through like the little circuit area. Right. And then he's like, about 1% are the regular weight room users. Now, to me, I'm one of the people who use the weight room. That's where I train people. That's where I go. So my thought was, everyone's down here. And he's like, you could probably name almost every member that uses the weight room. He's like, we have 5,000. Yeah. We have 5,000 members. I know you don't know all 5,000 of them. I'm like, oh, that's a really good point. So just to dispel this idea that the BMI is off because it doesn't account for muscles, no one works out. Like very, very few people.
I think Stu Phillips said it was like 3% of people, I'm misquoting, but a very, very low amount do any form of structured exercise. And that's even more recent, right? Yeah. So, and then good point on the low numbers. Because another thing you and I have talked about this before, because you probably heard us just say all these diets, haven't really worked. And you're thinking, yeah, but I know it seems like everyone is on paleo or carnivore or vegan or intermittent fasting. And when you use Twitter as an example, you may be able to reach, especially thank you to the algorithm, the small, tiny percentage of 100,000 people currently using that diet online. And it seems like such a big number, right? There's like thousands of people, but out of billions. So it is still a very small number. It's just they found each other in Twitter or Instagram or whatever, and then the algorithm has added you to that group. So you see it, but you don't. In fact, the algorithm's so good that you actually only see the success stories too. So out of that 100,000, you see the 5,000 who've just lost weight and look great, and they're the ones producing content, right? So you have to remember with all these diets or exercise programs or workouts, you're typically seeing the algorithm's version of the population it thinks you want to see, and not a great snippet of the world as a whole.
Yeah, that's a good point. How many people who failed miserably on any of those routines are actively posting and have followings and starting threads all over the place? So it's just so self-selective, like when you're viewing any of this stuff online.
Yeah, so it's difficult. It's still difficult to lose weight, despite the fact, man, it just exponential growth in our understanding, in our naming of the mechanisms and pathways in our bodies. Like we're getting really good at naming everything and kind of thinking we know what they do, but it still hasn't helped us with the proper intervention, if there is one.
Somebody just forwarded me a paper about a researcher there was a controversy over the results of a paper trying to argue back and forth whether it's just the calories in, calories out theory of weight loss versus insulin resistance theory. And then another research, and this was published in a big time journal, I think like Nature. And another research group was disputing their results, tried to reanalyze their results, saying, no, see, this disproves, whatever you thought you just proved about it. And I kind of just laughed a little bit about it, thinking none of this works. Like none of this matters anyways, because as proof by the fact that we just stated, obesity just keeps going up and up and up. Whoever wins this little debate over dissecting down what the research in one paper, in the end, it's like people are failing on both of these.
Actually, it's funny because they all work and they all don't work, because people have also had success on a certain type. So there are definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, bet my house on it, bodybuilders who have won high-level bodybuilding competitions by counting their calories. So that works. And I'm sure there's people who have gotten into Hollywood levels of shreddedness doing carnivore or keto. So they both work, but at the same time, for hundreds of thousands of people, they don't work at the same. So so the argument is sort of moot. Yeah. Right. Well, it's both.
Right. So whoever wins this little debate, it's not like, okay, now we have the answer. Now definitively the entire population has their best guidance on how to get control of their body composition.
They're actually asking the wrong question.
Yeah.
If you think about it, instead they should be asking, okay, even if this both were to work, calories or carbohydrate, insulin, why don't they work? Is what they should be. And then you can't just sit there and blame the whole trope of it's because massive corporations put profits in front of health. It's got to be more than that, right? Which we'll get into. But if you're getting this confused and muddied of an answer, you're wording the question incorrectly.
And that's now, 2024. We're not talking about 35-year-old research where since then we figured out X, Y, or Z. No, they're still trying to figure this out. And there's still something published in one of the leading journals in the world still has a group of researchers who I think that's totally wrong. And they reanalyze the other person's data. It's not like they're...
I think they're threatening to sue each other on defamation. It's so dumb. So dumb.
Yeah. And in the end, like Brad said, both can work.
Yeah. Both can't work.
Both can fail.
Yeah.
So you brought this up, and this was a good, we had to talk about this, and it really got me thinking about the adaptability of the human body, and that maybe we don't really appreciate that we're just constantly adapting to our surroundings for better or for worse. It doesn't matter what you would hope your adaptation would be. Your body's adapting whether or not you're even aware of it.
Constantly. You know is it DC Comics Amazo? That robot, it just adapts to whatever's fighting it. That's kind of what we are, right? That kind of idea. But we've managed to adapt from tropical primates, for lack of a better term, to being like, I'm gonna go venture into the Arctic and check it out, and we survived, right? And then we can adapt. There are people out there right now living off of zero exercise, McDonald's, and cigarettes, and they're going to make it to 65 years old, right? Like, and then there's we can adapt to almost anything, it feels like, right? And so the question becomes, if we're that adaptable, then our body is constantly reading inputs. And the inputs aren't just, this is where I think this research falls apart, diet and exercise. There's probably 100,000 inputs your body's reading at any given time, at any given day. And then based on all those inputs, it's deciding what is best for you to thrive and survive. So based on that concept, you have to think, hey, we should do a thought experiment that what if the amount of body fat you're currently carrying is on purpose? Is actually the correct amount your body thinks given those inputs. And then your body, unbeknownst to you, is driving your exercise levels and your appetite and your cravings for sugar or fat or carbs or whatever to regulate that level of body fat, that it's like, yeah, this is the amount based on what everything's telling me. This is kind of the amount of muscle you need, and this is the kind of amount of fat you need, and based on that, this kind of amount of bone you need, and we're good. And then if you think of it that way as a sum total of all these inputs, no wonder just playing around with someone's diet for 12 weeks will always work in a study when you're forcing them to do it. No wonder it works when you just decide to be determined because you're going to get ready for a vacation over 12 weeks. But again, no wonder long-term it doesn't work, because in the end, if our body is trying to get us to a certain weight, you're just fighting against your own body. You're probably going to lose that battle at some point.
Yeah, and a weight loss study is a major difference in an input.
That's huge. Yeah.
Think about what Brad just said. So if you're in a weight loss study, that likely means you live near a university, means you probably have some kind of nutritionist and trainer that's teaching you how to do whatever the protocols are for that weight loss study. You're either on a supplement or some kind of drug or an exercise program or all of them.
Yeah. It's a weight loss study and you don't want to fail at it.
Oh, huge. Yeah, your cognitive, that's probably the biggest. You have a massive bias because you're in a weight loss study.
How do you blind to that?
And we know, we've been involved in weight loss studies where people who were on a supplement and wanted to find out if they were in the placebo or not. So you just can't remove the bias of just being in a study. So that's an enormous change in input. The minute you take the study away, you think it's just back, you're going to keep doing that, or you think you're back to what you were doing before the intervention of the weight loss study.
Yeah. And in fact, if you think about it, the fact that you have to, or we constantly talk about willpower in weight loss, is just evidence you are fighting against your body. So the question isn't, how do we defeat this? Well, I guess it is a question, but you're almost like, start with the question of why does my body think that's the right amount of fat for me at this time? And then what are the inputs? Like what's going on here? So, and I think that's why they constantly falter in their studies, is because they come from the mindset, okay, it is a mistake that we have this much body fat. It is a dysfunction. It is a disease. It is something is working improperly and we're going to fix it, as opposed to everything's working exactly the way it should be. We have to change the inputs.
Right. And that's the problem. You can't take the fish out of the water. No. So if you're living in what, is colloquially called an obesogenic society in modern Western wealthy societies, basically there's a lot of cheap, super palatable, borderline addictive foods you can get your hands on. There's no real eating tradition in North America as rooted in
eat is a tradition.
Not compared to like older societies. Like it's most extremely expressed in North America because Canada and the United States are such young countries. Now, even though both countries are populated by immigrants from every other everywhere else. And a lot, you can get any food you want in North America. The tradition though, like the actual act of sitting down, like who sits down with their family to eat anymore, like a meal? Like there's so many eating traditions that didn't carry over from the old world to North America. So with all of the benefits of the new world, there is something that was lost that probably had some wisdom in it. So there's a concept of just a lot of food that's highly palatable, borderline addictive, that you can get your hands on anytime you want. And there's nothing in our society suggesting you should hold off on that. Like you can eat in the car, you can eat when you're walking, there's no tradition of when a meal is supposed to happen. All there is eat whenever you feel like it. So that's a major input. Like how do you compete against that degree of input? Or how do you imply all of those inputs are wrong? They are what they are, and our body's reaction to it is what it is. And to Brad's point, who says this isn't exactly how your body's supposed to react to this environment?
Yeah, an environment you brought this up earlier, an environment where we're doing our best to remove the sine wave of life. So you just brought up meals, right? We've removed the sine wave of meals for the day, and we've kind of replaced it with this really jagged heart attack looking thing, right? So then we've removed the sine wave of temperature, the sine wave of really air quality, of movement, right? Like
light.
Light. It's so we've normalized everything down to, I mean, it's interesting. We were just talking about people who use the continuous glucose monitor, and they measure their insulin levels like minute by minute. And I've noticed the weird trend there is they're trying to normalize that. They don't want any spikes because all the insulin's bad, all the spikes are bad. And I'm like, well, everything else kind of has a rhythm like that, right? Your growth hormone, your testosterone, your insulin, like every other hormone, but they're trying to take insulin and just normalize it into a straight line. And I think that has a lot to say to our ability to read the inputs. Is if it's all just noise, it's hard to read it.
That's a super good point. So for continuous glucose monitors, or basically any of this monitoring, have you done the base research to know what you should see? Like you are supposed to see glucose change after you eat. Now there's a time frame, there's a magnitude, there's a duration and a magnitude, just like a sine wave, like Brad was saying. All things biologically seem to have like a wave pattern. So are you aware and are you prepared when you see what your glucose monitor is telling you? That's a normal increase in glucose, that's a normal dip, and that's a normal range, and I'm back to where I belong. Like, since when do average people see that? Like, who trained you to know that? Unless you're researching in that field and you have like the experience to see what's an typical healthy response versus an abnormal. Don't even want to say healthy, normal versus abnormal response, and even know how to interpret that.
Well, and then gets to, I think we've talked about this in podcasts already, but we know from our research that heat affects that, how quickly insulin comes back, goes up and comes down. So how warm was the room you're in? How much water you drank with the glucose, that can affect it. You had other ones that you had looked at when you guys were doing OGTT stuff, but there's a lot of other inputs, we're back to inputs, that affect that one measurement you're trying to take and normalize across your life's weeks, months, and years. Like it's very difficult to do, but you're trying to kind of flatline everything.
Well, training status, like how old are you? Yeah. Like man versus woman, like, pregnancy status, like all of that stuff. We're not all the same person. So if you just grab a glucose monitor, you have to take all of that into context and understand what that reading
I forget,
is.
does sleep affect it? I think it does too, right?
Yeah. Totally. Sleep will affect it for sure. So all of that stuff will, and so you could have what might look like an abnormal response, but let's say you just had a lousy 3 days, you didn't sleep well, you're super stressed, something happened, and makes sense that you're like, oh yeah, no wonder my system's kind of off right now. So there's a pro and a con to all of this, like, measurement that we're capable of doing with devices now.
Yep.
So, but you have to be aware of what it is you're measuring, and is it
when do you stop, right? So your measurements found in early cancer, that's good, right? But then you're not going to getting a scan daily or hourly, because that would be a bit obsessive and probably eventually you'll get false readings.
Yeah, and there's the sensitivity and the specificity of the tests, like how common is it to get a false negative or a false positive on the specific test you're doing? And then how do you manage that information on the other side of it? Like, what action do you take? Do you take no action? So, I mean, all of this is staying, all of this monitoring, self-monitoring, biohacking, whatever you want to call it. It's not going anywhere. We're just going to get more and more ability to monitor ourselves. But with that comes the responsibility of knowing what to do with that information as you get it. And to cycle back to Brad's point, is there a body size you just assumed you were supposed to be? And no matter what environment on Earth you were in, so North America or somewhere else, and whatever your occupation happens to be, are you busy during the day? Are you not? And whatever's going on in your house on a daily basis with your family or whoever you live with, what makes you think you were supposed to be at a specific body size in that environment? Like, I think we all have this, I don't know if it's a naive or a blue sky, rosy colored glasses assumption that we're all are this perfect system that should be able to handle any environment. And we should always, on the other end of it, look like our ideal body shape.
That's the main thing is realizing that we are so incredibly adaptable, but every adaptation is not going to make you look like Chris Hemsworth or whatever the woman counterpart of that was. Scarlett Johansson, we'll say that, right? Like, we just assume that somehow the adaptation is always going to make us gorgeous, and that's not the case. Some of the adaptations are odd. We don't understand why. So an adaptation to a child during the early prepubertal stage, if there's high psychological stress, can permanently stunt their growth. And that's an adaptation, right? So it's like, how did you account for that in the trials here? If something like psychological stress can stunt something as massive as bone growth, then it seems like everything's fair game for adipose tissue expansion and contraction. So yeah, it comes down to every adaptation there isn't going to lead you towards a superhero body. It could be the other direction, and that would be the best adaptation for that situation somehow.
There's data supporting the theory that your parents' BMI at conception of you will affect your BMI.
Yeah, so,
and
there's probably a reason for that, right?
Mm-hmm. Your mother's BMI while you're in utero, her palate, what she eats while you're in utero,
right. Yep.
Her stress levels, the degree of stress she's going through, all of that somehow genetically, epigenetically, some combination has been proven to be linked to what you're going to come out like.
I'm remembering something, but I can't quite but there was data. I forget what the actual outcome was, but looking at things that skip generation. So like the grandparent at the time of it just keeps flowing. But the important thing to question is wonder, what if that's all on purpose? So not a mistake, not some weird, I can't imagine it happens, but amazing that the internal operating system we run on was able to pick up on that and adjust for it, right? And thinking that everything, you have that human operating system, right? It makes your heart beat and regulates every hormone. You're not thinking about doing that. It just does it in the background. So there is an operating system constantly working, reading input. So somehow we have this weird way of assuming the fact that when we lift weights, our muscles get bigger is like, that's a good thing on purpose. But the fact when we eat too much or in the wrong environment, we gain fat, that's a mistake. Is interesting that we bias ourselves that way. Whereas if you think everything is the correct outcome, given all the inputs given, whether it's your mother's stress levels or her diet at birth, there is a reason for that outcome. And there's actually a reason for that outcome being ideal for just your body's wanting to thrive and survive, as opposed to making you 6'4" and lean, right? Or whatever the case may be. But it's just, our biases make us sometimes think of things as dysfunctions or mistakes, when I think they're just more adjustments based on the inputs. Yeah.
And so that bias is, maybe it's a preference. Maybe you don't like how your body's adapting. Yeah. Maybe you don't like, I would prefer if I had an easier time being leaner in what is otherwise an obesogenic environment living in North America. So, but you basically been handed a deck of cards with the genes and how your body, it reacts, that you never chose. They were just handed to you when you were born, like we said, with all of the different inputs. And you kind of, as you grow up, you realize what cards you're playing. Like, we all know, maybe you're listening and you are this person, but we all know somebody who just doesn't gain fat. They don't do anything. They don't diet. They don't really even exercise all that much, if at all, or nothing special. They're not doing anything special. They're just that person that just doesn't gain any fat. So that their deck of cards, that's just how they were shuffled up, and that's what they get in this. And they're right next to you in an environment where you seem to gain weight and they don't, or someone else gains weight and they don't. I mean, I'm talking about two people living in the same house.
Yeah. And it's a funny thing there is it's not that they're immune to the inputs. They are reading the exact same inputs. And for whatever reason, this is how it's read for their body. There is really interesting area of research looking at surface area versus mass. And the correlation between those two, the intersection of them, determines when you start adding fat during puberty. Right? Or it determines when you start shivering, when it's cold out. It determines all sorts of things, this sort of weird intersection. So considering the fact that you have certain areas of your body, your hands, your ears, that are just massive in surface area, that slight alterations in the sizes of those to two people who are 5'8" may mean reading inputs differently just based on their surface area to mass ratios. It's crazy. So what I was getting at, the point you were making, it still doesn't neglect the idea of inputs. It's just that they're going to be read so differently for people who you may at first glance think are very similar, even family members. Yeah.
Another reason why you can't compare yourself to anybody else.
No.
And it's okay to, we're not saying, well, you're just fat, so sucks for you. Like you can intervene. Obviously, we all try to intervene if we want to change the look and shape of our body and have any conscious effect on our health outcomes. But so it's okay to have an aspiration to something other than, if you're not happy with the way you look or you prefer to look a different way, there's tons of stuff you can do.
Absolutely.
But how you're built and shaped is just an adaptation to where you are, and it doesn't have anything to do with how anyone else adapts. And the other idea is, no one who said you were supposed to live 100 years old and be in shape the whole time. Like, no one said that. There's nothing predetermined about life by how long you're going to make it, what you're going to look like the whole way, how you're going to feel. None of that's predetermined.
Great goal, but not a promise, right? I guess.
No, not a promise at all. There's no, I think people get to this point where they think like it's unfair because somebody else, again, it always comes back to this fairness thing. Like, people keep comparing themselves to everyone. Well, like, how come that person looks like that? They eat whatever they want. And that doesn't, all right, you can stress about that all you want. Not going to change your situation at all. Yep. It's just going to make you resent them and just be even more upset about how whatever cards
studying,
you were dealt.
but not getting built up over, right? So I think the point is, to your point, everyone can intervene, and with the right intervention, you can build muscle and lose fat, right? I pretty much anyone offered $100 million, I think could probably get in shape for a contest, right? Like some sort of way. But the key is, the more you work with and identify inputs, the easier you can make that process and the longer lasting you can make the results. And that's the hard part. And that's the part I think that we're skipping. I mean, you and I have written books on CO2 in the air. We've written books on heat. We've written books on gut bacteria before gut bacteria was a thing. They don't nearly get the traction as a book on diet or a book on workouts, because we get those interventions, but we don't get all the other inputs that could make those interventions maybe permanent, right? Like, we have to start looking at all the other inputs. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not real. And then work within those inputs to be like, man, how could we make it so that the natural inclination is to eat a little less and the natural inclination is to move a little more, right? Because just telling someone to, hey, eat less and move more is like, hey, save money, invest wisely. And you're like, okay, how? Like, how, I don't actually know. Can you walk me through the invest? Yeah, you just invest in things that are growing. And you're like, well, that's just useless advice, because I don't know how to invest, right? So unless you're going to
pick winners.
Pick winners, right? Or just talk to your broker. I'm like, I don't understand any of what you're saying. So it's that saying, I mean, technically, save money, invest well is fantastic advice. Same with eat less and move more, except the application is next to zero unless the person already knows what you're talking about, which means then that advice is useless. Right? So those two steps could be downstream of many other inputs that need to be addressed first. Yeah, I was just going to get there. Is like, sometimes if your environment and inputs are just driving you to eat, then man, it's going to be just an uphill battle for you to diet down. But if you remove those, whatever inputs that is, everything gets easier. So sometimes it is addressing the inputs first that matters the most, right? So,
well, I mean, and let's just talk about some of these inputs. So one of them is your circadian rhythm. Just are you, for example, sleep. Sleep's a big one. If your sleep pattern can be more or less favorable to managing your metabolic health. So there's the concept of you an early or late sleeper. So do you just naturally go to bed early or late? Now society's built around favoring the early sleeper who gets up early, but that's not, if you're not an early person, you'll always be fighting an uphill battle to fit yourself into an early person lifestyle. And on top of that, there's long and short sleepers. So you can be someone who needs 6 hours and you'd find there's no way to measure any a negative metabolic consequence. And you could be someone who needs 8, pushing 9 hours. So everyone falls in a range, but the range is kind of big. Like,
I bet you it changes too for the person, right? Like
probably over
life,
their lifetime,
decades. Yeah.
But think about this. Think about how wild this can get. So an early short sleeper is someone who might naturally just start, and everyone knows this person. You either are this person or you know this person who you can just watch the life just disappear out of them around 9 o'clock ish. Like I know some that like around 8:30, you can just see them fading. And by 9:30, they're gone. They're just gone at night. So an early short sleeper is someone who genetically only needs maybe six and a half hours, and they're okay. And that's totally legitimate in the research. Some people only need that much. So what if you're an early short sleeper? Like you're out cold and you just cannot get past 10 p.m. But six and a half hours, you're golden. So that means you go from 10 at night, you fall asleep and you're up 4 or 5. 5 a.m. and you're ready to go. You pop out of bed at 5 a.m. ready to. I know these people, and I'm sure if you aren't this person, you might know this. So that's an early short. What if that early short person lives in or is dating a late long sleeper? So someone who naturally goes to bed around, let's say midnight. That's not even that late, but let's say midnight.
Right.
So you the two of you are off by 2 hours, right? But let's say genetically that late long sleeper also needs 8 hours of sleep just to feel like they've got enough. And genetically that's totally legitimate. So now you got one person who goes to bed at 10, wakes up at 6. You got one person that goes to bed at midnight and wakes up, or sorry, not even 6, wakes up at 5. And another person that goes to bed at midnight wakes up maybe at 8. They're off by 3 hours in the morning and at night. So,
and then their peak energy times are different too during the day, right?
Oh, don't even talk to them at the wrong time of day. So at the peak energy person, for the evening person is they're like want to do something and the other person's just gone. Yeah. And just because they went to bed at 10 didn't mean they were like raring to go at 9. They're like already on their way, sort of their energy levels are dropping. And then the late long sleeper takes them a little bit to wake up in the morning, whereas the early short sleeper's been going at it for 3 hours. They're just doing their day. So these two people, I don't even know how they could ever coexist. They're missing 6 hours a day of each other's energy and time.
Yeah.
So that's just a simple example of two people who are just genetically built that way. There's nothing wrong with either case.
Right.
But that's how different you can be. If either person is forced to live in the other person's pattern, that alone can mess up any chance they have in an effective diet or exercise program to do anything to change the composition of their body.
And we haven't even begun to discuss the idea of those hundreds of thousands of inputs. The inputs may act not individually, but together, right? So it could be as weird as light exposure and vitamin content of your foods combined with sleep and temperature of the house. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so it gets to the point where it really needs to be studied, your entire environment. But since those studies aren't going to be done, it's now up to you to figure this stuff out. And I think everyone probably listening has experienced that one time where you just got into a flow and weight loss was just sort of happening. And you've had other times where you're like, okay, I've got to fix this. We've got a wedding coming up. And no matter how hard you tried, that night you're just pounding fudge. Oh, you don't have Fudgios in the States. You're pounding cookies. Fudgios are amazing. And you're sitting there going like, I'm literally eating cookies, planning out my diet for tomorrow. What is wrong with me? Right. And I think it's not, nothing's wrong with you. That's the main point. It's the environmental cues going on that you're sort of out of a routine that's going to lead you in the right direction. Right. The ideal direction for you. And so you have to work with these inputs and really start track. I don't want everyone tracking temperature of my house and CO2 levels and light exposure, how many lumens, how much sleep, but you kind of have to at some point, kind of like how we recommend, we don't want people to always calorie count, but every once in a while doing it for a week or two is really eye-opening. Same idea, right? I think that these things are worth paying attention to and measuring for a couple of weeks out of every couple months, and just realize, oh yeah, that's off, or that's chillier, or that's brighter or lighter, and try to see if you can't find correlations that work for you. But to your point, and some of them aren't changeable. Like I don't think a early light sleeper, early short sleeper just becomes a late sleeper right away.
No, you
right?
can't.
No,
You can't. No.
You have to work within the inputs.
Right. So, yeah. So it could get depressing because we've just pointed out so many different things. Where do you even start? So I guess the first step is being aware that all of these inputs can influence the look and shape of your body. And then if you want to change that, you've got to take at least some inventory of what's changeable. Like, what could you change? And the degree of impact those things are going to have. So it's right on the line of like monitoring everything or just doing nothing.
Okay.
So doing nothing is how, okay, let's say it this way. Without actively intervening, actually, no, change that. If you just stood naked in front of the mirror right now and just looked at yourself, and then the thought is how I eat and how I exercise and how I live makes you look like that
On purpose. It's not like that's how your body's reacted to that. Yeah.
Your body, this is your body's reaction to everything that's happening, conscious and non, like what you're consciously doing and what's just happening to you. So if you want that image in the mirror to change, you've got multiple levers you can pull. It's which ones are the most important ones to pull. If you're already exercising, assuming your program is well built and you're actually putting real effort into it, you've already pulled that lever. The lever most people are constantly trying to pull and can't figure it out quite is diet. So we're assuming at some point you'll try that one. But it's likely that lever is downstream of a few others that need to be pulled first. Maybe the sleep thing, maybe the temperature thing, maybe probably a stress thing. But you got to figure out which. It's likely there's one or two other levers that need to be pulled before the diet lever can be pulled effectively.
Yeah. So an optimist point of view here, because I really like the way you direction is like if diet's not working well, it's just because you haven't found the right other levers to pull first. And I was just wondering before you said that there are probably, we have 25 million years of evolution, and then of that before we became like Homo sapiens, like 3 million years. There's probably some constrained inputs that are the really important ones, and inputs that have kept with it. Like if you think about it, of all that development time, we've maintained the ability to build body fat, right? Like really quickly. Like it's amazing how fast imagine you could build muscle that fast. It'd be amazing, but you can't. So there must be some of these inputs that are just constrained as like top level, really important ones. And so it's figuring that out and going, okay, the last couple of times I dieted, it didn't work. I'm going to try to move some of these other levers first and see if it makes the dieting easier. Is a really cool experiment and a really optimistic way to view dieting if it hasn't worked for you before.
I think one of them would be sleep, like we talked about.
Yeah.
Examine that. If your sleep's really good, then maybe it's not a lever worth pulling. I'd say that's the first one to at least look at.
Oh, yeah.
Another one is your environment at home.
Yeah.
Like, is anyone else at home trying to lose weight? It really helps if somebody else is trying. It's really hard if not only are people not trying, but they're actively pushing against you, making fun of you.
Which does happen.
Just sabotaging, just sort of, what are you doing that for? Always putting something in front of you to draw you away from weight loss versus towards it.
Yep.
So that actually, in my experience with people, that's likely one of the biggest. Like before sleep, before any of these, physiological ones, like the light, the heat, the sleep, is somebody socially just getting in your way. Or just not helping, like just not supporting at all.
I guess one of the main reasons of when you hire a trainer, it's funny, is you get their expertise, but you get their social support. which is I think is a massively underrated part of actually hiring a trainer, is someone who's there holding you accountable, but also supporting you along the way, which a lot of people don't have, right? So,
for some of the people I've worked with, I'm the only person in their life they've told they're trying to do this.
wow.
They haven't told significant others. They haven't told friends. They haven't told family members. I guess they've figured out along the way it's failed, and without saying it, they've recognized certain people are actually sort of sabotaging it, or just kind of sneer at them, or like, what are you doing that for? And
Right.
that little negative dig is enough to just take the wind right out of their sails. So they literally need somebody on their side. It almost doesn't matter. I mean, lots of people who coach people know what they're doing as far as structuring a program and knowing how to guide them through a diet, and not even being dogmatic about, well, you got to eat keto. They work with them. What's working for them? It's not anybody who knows what they're doing as far as that type of coaching should be able to be flexible and see what's working for you.
Recognize the high level inputs, like we're talking high level levers. Yeah.
Right. But the one major thing is they're on your side.
Yeah.
Like they're completely on your side, and they're there when you're doing well. They're there when you're stumbling and you fall down and got to get back up. And the point is, you shouldn't if they're good at it, you're not going to feel like embarrassed when you actually stray from your program, which everybody does. We all do. Everybody, even top level bodybuilders will break and crush a pizza right before a show.
12 pack of donuts.
Everyone stumbles, but it's like people have learned that it's hard to find people that are going to support you, especially if they're not actively doing it. Like if you're don't have a training partner or a significant other's doing literally step for step with you, you're up against a wave going the other direction, at least in North America, for sure.
Yeah.
So having somebody on your side, just sort of, you're like, oh, okay, at least I have one person on my team here. Like at least there's me and one person.
And that'll help balance like the work stress, the psychological stress of work, et cetera, right? If you just have someone in your corner while you're trying to diet, because I think that work stress, school stress, whatever the case may be, home stress needs to be balanced and addressed in order for the weight loss to work, right? So having someone there in your corner is big.
Well, just imagine it the other way around. Imagine every single person you interact with in life is actively pursuing some kind of weight loss. Okay, again, speaking in the construct of someone trying to lose weight. Let's say you're trying to lose weight.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say everyone in your house that you live with is actively trying to lose weight and doing a pretty good job at it.
Yeah.
Let's say everyone you work with is doing it. And let's say everyone you bump into everywhere socially is also not only trying to lose weight, but actually getting somewhere. They're actually relatively consistent.
Feeling some success, yeah.
Do you think that'd be an easier environment to actually get somewhere? Or would you be the one person gaining weight? Everyone else is succeeding and you're not.
Yeah, you'd not be that person. You would be losing with them, right? Like crabs in a bucket, they drag you that way regardless, right? So
that's the only case where you'd want the crab, like you climbing out of the bucket trying to gain weight. Like that'd be the only time where you'd want them to pull you back in, because they're like, no, come join us. We're all losing weight here. Like let's just lose weight together.
I think remember the so pre this version of the internet, we had the Adonis and Venus community. So they were online forums when forums were big things. I think that was one of the massive benefits of that forum approach, right? Is people were all in it together, talking about it, but sharing success. And I feel like they were building momentum as a group. Kind of the opposite. We talked about the guys in the Ansel Keys studies and how the almost psychosis of the diet was building up as they all sort of were sharing their stories with each other about how hungry they were. It's almost the opposite of that, right? They're all sharing, it's starting to work, I'm feeling better with myself. And then it builds this momentum in the right positive momentum. Yeah.
I mean, it's good that online communities exist. And I'm sure there's tons that you can join. What kind of statement is that? That means you've got to go find some people that might not even live in the same country as you to find support, because you can't even get it in your own house.
That's true. Yeah.
That's kind of where we've arrived at. So it's, I guess it's the good thing is that actually exists. You can find people that are like-minded, and at least the medium of an app or a community or something. It's real. Those are real people. You can talk, and we know people who've built friendships who now visit each other across the country through the communities we built. So it's legit and it's real, and real friendships can come of it. It's just a bummer sometimes when it'd be really nice if that person lived with you. It would just be that much easier if it was the person you sat down and ate dinner with. But I mean, that's what we're up against. And it's a personal choice. And even if no one else in your life directly, like literally day to day, is making the same choice, it doesn't mean you can't make the choice. It's just, you gotta understand what you're up against. That's it. I mean, full stop.
And it's funny. It sounds like we're off on a tangent, but it's showing that socialization, positive socialization, is another input that your body's constantly reading, and a really important one. So it's one of those high lever levers we talked about, right? So, but yeah,
and it might not actually be so easy to pull that lever like in your house, but again, circling back to the online community, at least that's one way to pull the social, this is a tough one to say, support lever, by using some sort of online community. That's a big maybe that's the lever you have to pull before you even take a shot at.
Yeah. And you know what? I think that the way the Twitter and those things work, it's almost that way, right? You find this community, you get really involved in the community, you find the kind of leaders and support in the community, then you take the leap, right? But coaches do that too. But to kind of wrap this back up, it's just the idea that, leading all the way back to that first study you talked about, is the assumption that the way you look now is on purpose. It's your body's reading of the inputs, then leads you to, wow, we are that adaptable, which leads you to, if I want to change the way I look, I have to obviously change the big things, which is diet and exercise. But then I have to start exploring what inputs are affecting diet and exercise, what inputs are affecting my being a little bit hungry, wanting to move, wanting not to move, etc. And kind of tweaking those dials is what's going to make this a lot easier in the long run. And then identifying them, what they are for you individually. Because like you said, what works for a short early sleeper might not work for a long late sleeper. Like, there's so many things going on that it really has to be an individualized plan of what inputs work best for me and when.
Mm-hmm. And not to sound harsh, but the reality of it is there's no predetermined fairness to any of this. If it feels like somebody's just got it easier than you, maybe as far as body composition, just the look and shape of your body, not saying that there's other things going on in their life, but as far as body composition, if it feels like someone has it easier than you, yes, somebody does for sure have it easier than you.
And a good way to battle that is if you're jealous of someone's, let's say, their body composition, you have to go, would I trade everything? Not just, okay, I want her abs, but like, hey, would I want her life, her job, her husband, or her wife? And no, I wouldn't want that whole thing. And you start realizing it is a totality of all the inputs. So it helps you kind of keep that in perspective, right? If you're going to be jealous of something's money or looks, you have to be jealous of the whole package. And that usually brings you back down to a bit more of a realistic spot.
Yeah, well, who cares? Who cares what's going on in their life? Yeah. It's theirs. It's not yours. I mean, all you have is yours. Like, your life's the only one you're getting. It doesn't matter what's going on in anyone else's life. So the quicker you stop thinking about other people and what's going on in their life, not saying anyone is, but that's for sure someone you got to get out of your head. It doesn't matter what's going on with anybody else. It just matters what's going on with you. And the way you look and feel is your body's collection of, it's your body's response to all the inputs it's faced with so far.
Yeah. And inputs, I want to just hammer this home, is like you don't realize, oh, my body's making me a bit more hungry right now. You just take a couple extra bites, right? And you don't, it's really hard for people to get that concept that, like, when I say temperature affects how much you eat, and that's why restaurants tend to be a bit chilly, you don't think, I walked into a restaurant, felt cold, so I got some more to eat. You just ate a bit more, or you ordered something a bit larger than you would have, but you don't make that. The operating system is independent of those kind of thoughts, right? So you do have to really focus on what the inputs could be and then adjust as necessary.
Mm-hmm. And you can intervene to whatever degree you want, if you want to change. I mean,
yeah, that's true.
Something that's recently that's kind of shed a lot of light on this is the Ozempic, Mounjaro, the weight loss drugs. The weight loss drugs that seem to be working really, really well for a lot of people. It's for whatever all of the inputs are, this one intervention for many, many people seems to help them deal with all of those. Yeah. Whatever they are. So that's just proof that something something can be done if all else fails. And let's say you were kind of opposed to the idea of a drug and you've been trying to pull some of these levers. It's just too hard. You can't figure it out. Socially, it's too hard. Whatever it is, it's just too hard. Many people I've worked with, that's the thing that's got them moving in the right direction. And it might buy you some time and mental space to actually examine some of the levers.
So it dulls some of the input readers that would direct you towards eating more. Basically, yeah. So cool way to think of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like remember we were talking like people, it's very routine. You'll read it in forums, but people talk about the food chatter. They're not just constantly obsessed thinking about food. So whatever the inputs were that led you to that anyways, at least that is not like pushing you around. And in that quiet, let's call it quiet, that mental quiet, where you're actually sort of have more control over the whole situation, might give you some clarity on like, oh yeah, but you know what? I was going to eat because I just talked to whoever and that just upset me. And I was headed towards the fridge, but I'm not actually that hungry. And I just recognized right in that moment, I was going to go eat something for no other reason than I just got upset in that argument or something like that. Fasting does it too. Now that's a conscious choice. But if you've committed to yourself, and
it's a weird on-off, it helps a lot of people with that. Yeah. So fasting isn't a diet. It's just the idea. I'm just not going to eat till whatever time it
today.
removes the constant thought of what and how much.
Yeah. So if you're actually, yes, right. There's no what, there's no how much, there's no, I've got to it's like lower carbs, whatever. Yeah. So let's say today you're just fasting and you still have that conversation. So you're not on Ozempic or a drug. You're just fasting. So it's recreating the same situation. To some degree, that person, you have that conversation, it upsets you. You're going to go eat, but you're like, no, I'm fasting today. Now, again, in this case, it's a bit more willpower than on like an Ozempic. But either way, the sort of space, the clarity, the quiet of the fasting kind of is like, oh, shoot, I was just about to go eat. I'm not hungry. I'm just pissed off. Yeah. I was about to go eat again.
I think, you know what? Carnivore probably does something similar when your what and how much is limited. I think it's red meat and eggs or something along those lines, like 3 choices. I think that also removes a lot of the mind chatter of like, hey, what I'm going to eat and how much of it and what are all my thousands of options. You're kind of like, well, I have 2 options and okay, wait a second. Do I want to go out and barbecue steak right now? Or am I just pissed off at something John said, right? So any diet that sort of does put sort of restraints, which I think we've actually argued against being good in the past, but I think I see how that does work for the food chatter.
Yeah, well, it gives you some mental room to examine why you're doing something in that moment.
Yeah,
right. And so some of these other things are subtle. Like let's say you had a lousy couple nights sleep, and then in the subsequent days you've eaten more. You might not put those things together. It's like kind of hours ago, and now you're up and you have your coffee and you're in your routine. It's now if we measured all of your labs, we'd be like, look, like you're insulin resistant right now, and it's because you didn't sleep. Like we could probably scientifically in a lab figure out why you had a couple lousy days of eating and maybe a couple lousy, you skipped the gym or your workout sucked, and it's supposed to be because you had 2 or 3 lousy days of sleep. But consciously, you might not be fully aware, like that 2 days later that crappy night's sleep still affecting you.
Right.
But in the case of fasting, it's pretty acute. Like that food, you've just agreed you're not eating today, and something that really pushes you to eat becomes ultra clear. And it's usually not hunger. It's something will pop up that irritated you or
almost
set
always.
You off or perturbed your system bad enough that you were many people will find they were gonna go use food to deal with a stress.
Yeah. And I think that to wrap up, one thing I want to point out is we're not saying you can't intervene. We're just pointing out the reasons why it's difficult, right? And why it does take willpower, why it does take routine and habit, and then that adjusting some of these inputs might make it easier, right? Because again, lots and lots of people are able to get in shape when they put their mind to it, for lack of better terms, right? But people find different degrees of difficulty in doing so. And we're saying it's the inputs that makes that so.
All right. So then I think that's a good place to wrap it up. And as Brad said, we're not saying you can't intervene. You can intervene as much or as little as you want. And we're just trying to give you a snapshot of all the different levers that could or might need to be pulled. And if you're struggling now, you might need to examine some of these other things and kind of take them in order to get to where you're trying to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And just a different sort of mind thought experiment that you talked about. It's like, okay, the way you look now is on purpose based on all the inputs. We have to adjust the inputs. You're not broken. It's just that's your body's way of reacting to everything.
All right, so I think that's a good place to leave it. So for Brad Pilon, I'm John Barbin, and that's your Phi Life podcast.